This video was sponsored by Policy Genius.
Previously on Bourbon Moth Woodworking.
Remember this guy? Michael Alm. Yeah, he stopped by the shop and he was like, "Hey Jason, you think we could build a boat in 5 days?" And I said, "Of course. All we need to get is a few sheets of plywood and we'll get going." So we got that plywood and we cut out a bunch of ribs. Actually, Michael cut out a bunch of ribs. I just kind of watched. Then we laid out those ribs in the shape of a boat. We had no clue what we were doing. We were just winging it and having a lot of fun. After we got the shape of the boat all knocked out, we cut out the ribs and the internal parts and made a spine. Then we made some chines. Made a spine, made some chines. And then I made a little bow cap out of solid walnut. Plopped it in there, and we cut out a little space for a cockpit. Do you call it a cockpit on a boat? I don't know, the place where the captain sits. Aye aye. Then I added a little wood to the transom so that we could slap on an outboard motor. We also got a steering kit in the mail so that we could retrofit the motor with a steering wheel. We made a dashboard, we cleaned up and sanded the whole thing, and in no time we had this. What roughly looked like a boat, or the skeleton of a boat, or the shape of a boat. But that's where we left off last time. Let's get this thing finished and slide it into the water, like an old lady taking a bath. So, with the entire structural ribbing skeleton of our boat complete, the next step was of course to cover the entire thing in plywood. Now, like I mentioned many times before, we have no clue what we're doing. I don't know if you're supposed to use 1/4-inch plywood, 1/2-inch plywood, 3/4-inch plywood. I don't know if you're supposed to fiberglass it or coat it in epoxy. We just were focused on the fact that we're trying to build a boat in 5 days. So we went with 1/4-inch because this plywood needs to bend a lot. We made a pretty curvy boat. We decided to start with each side of the boat first, get those panels done, and then we'll move on to the top and the bottom. So we roughly cut out some pieces that were definitely a little bigger than they needed to be for the side panels. We slapped them in place, held them there with a few clamps, and then we traced out the general shape of each side of the boat. Then we took those panels back over to the work table and we cut out that rough shape with a jigsaw. Now, because our boat is symmetrical, at least pretty symmetrical, we could use our first piece to trace out for our second piece. Unfortunately, because of the overall size and shape of the boat, we could only get one piece out of one full sheet of plywood. So we did have to waste a lot of plywood in the making of this boat, but I'll hold on to those scrap pieces and make a dollhouse or something for my wife. Anyways, once we got both side panels cut, we clamped them back in place just to make sure they fit the way they should, again leaving them a little large, overhanging on the top and bottom. We'll clean that up later. Then before we hooked them on, we thought it would be a good idea to throw a full sheet of plywood on the top and trace out the shape for our top panel. We just figured this would be easier to do it now rather than do it after we have plywood on the sides and the bottom, because then how are we going to get in there to trace out the shape? Well, I guess we still totally could have got in there. Oh, the cockpit, that was the thing. We couldn't reach inside and trace out where the cockpit is, and we wanted to be able to do that. So we traced that shape out and we just set that top panel aside. Then we grabbed some more Total Boat thickened epoxy, Thixo to be exact, and I lubed up one side of the boat with a ridiculous amount of thickened epoxy. Then while Michael held my bottom and I held the top, that sounded funny, we just stuck that side panel on there. And in true boat building fashion, added a ridiculous amount of clamps to the top and bottom. Now, if we had time, we would just let this sit, let the epoxy dry, and call it good. But we ain't got time for that. We're building a boat in 5 days, So we had to do something to be able to move forward and remove the clamps. So once again, I pulled out the 16 gauge staple gun and I stapled the top and bottom of each side panel to those convenient chines we put in there. This will hold the panels in place while the epoxy dries and will allow us to remove the clamps and keep moving forward. Speaking of removing clamps, we removed the clamps and we kept moving forward. Then with one side done, we did the exact same thing to the other side. A ridiculous amount of Total Boats thickened epoxy, and we slapped that panel in place. Easy peasy, epoxy squeezy. Then because we left the top and the bottom long on those panels, I just took a flush trim router bit and I hit both sides with the bit to make it nice and smooth. Well, as smooth as we could. It is a curved hull, so you couldn't get it absolutely perfect with the flush trim bit, but we got as close as we could on the top and bottom, and we did a little finagling with the hand sander, and eventually I even pulled out the Japanese pole saw and trimmed off a bit. Long story short, we got it all nice and flush to the chines in the end, and we were ready to start working on our bottom panel. Now, from the moment we decided to build this boat, the bottom panel was the thing I was the most nervous about, because it's got to bend a lot. The bottom curves quite a bit from back to front, and not only does it curve, it twists. And I didn't even know if 1/4-inch plywood would do that without breaking. It was all kind of a mystery. So we decided to make a template first out of a scrap piece of 1/4-inch plywood. I had this scrap piece of white oak just laying around, so we just threw that on there and started bending it. The tricky part was to get a nice line that would follow that center little rib spine thing, because as you can see, it's not a straight line, it's got a curve in a funky way. So we tried a chalk line, that didn't work. We tried a bendy piece of wood, that kind of worked, and then Michael just traced out the outside, getting a little too friendly as he did. Once we roughly had the shape that we thought was right, we cut the entire thing out with the jigsaw. And by we, I mean Michael, because if you haven't noticed, he does most of the work on this boat, and I just kind of stand around and watch him. Once we had our template piece cut out to what we thought was the right shape, we plopped it back on the bottom and we tried to push it down. But the problem is this boat bends so much that it's hard to get it down far enough to really get an accurate measurement. So we had to come up with some way to hold that piece in place while we got a good straight line. So we went out and bought some eye bolts and we bolted them in on either side. Then we used some ratchet straps from the inside that we could kind of weave around the boat and ratchet that piece down so it's nice and tight to the structure of the boat. Then, like geniuses we are, we pulled out a flippin' laser. That's right, pew pew pew, laser beams. The laser was perfect because it didn't move around like the chalk line or the bendy piece of wood, and it allowed us to get a nice, perfect line along that center spine. Once we had that shape the way we wanted it, we used the template to trace out that shape onto an actual piece of marine-grade plywood. Then we cut most of that shape with the track saw just to eliminate the amount of work we had to do with the jigsaw, and once we had a smaller piece, we finished up cutting our final curves and bends with the jigsaw. And by we, I mean me, because I do most of the work around here. Michael just kind of stands around and watches. But thankfully, the laser did the trick, and we were pretty confident that our bottom panel, at least this one, was the right shape. So back to more thickened epoxy and a lot of squirting and squeezing, and we plopped that panel in place. Now, this was a tricky thing to hold down because it's got so much bend to it that there's a lot of tension at the front. So we put as many clamps as we could on one side. Eventually the curve got so great that the clamps just wouldn't stay. And then Michael, using his extreme strength, just pushed that panel down the best he could while I sank in some staples to hold it nice and firm. I think we did have to use a couple screws at the very front just to give us a little more holding power, But that's okay, all these staples and screws will be completely covered with trim, so you're not going to see them, and you won't even know they're there. While I stapled, Mike removed all the clamps, and we were ready to get rocking on panel 2. We decided to throw our first template back up there just to double check and make sure that the second panel would be the same shape as the first panel. Because we couldn't clamp it down, we just screwed it in place so that we could get a nice feel for whether or not it would fit. And what do you know, it almost fit absolutely perfect. I was amazed how well this seam was going to come together on the bottom. So with that confidence, we took our template, traced out another piece for our second panel, and we got to work. Well, I mean, we didn't get to work then. We've been working this whole time. I mean, we got to work on the second. You know what I mean. So with our second panel cut out, we lubed up the whole thing again with some more Total Boat thickened epoxy, and we plopped it in place. Now, unlike the first panel, we couldn't clamp the inner seam in place while we worked. So it was just straight to the staple gun. I started at the back and slowly worked my way forward, making sure that seam was nice and tight, and Mike's muscles at this point had to have been aching because he was really pushing that thing down for me. But in no time, we had the bottom completely skinned with a beautiful layer of 1/4-inch Akume ply. Yes, we left the sides long on this as well. Don't worry, we'll come back and trim those down here in a bit. But it was looking good, and we were pretty happy.
How are the states from the photo that we were copying? Yeah! We made it! Nice work.
That thing looks
It looks so
sexy.
sweet. That's awesome. That's so cool.
All right, guys, get a hold of yourselves. It's not done yet. Now, with the boat flipped over, we did something that might have been unnecessary, but I just wanted to do it for reassurance, and that was to take some 3M 5200 sealant adhesive stuff, and we basically used it as caulking on every internal seam, just to make sure that everything was sealed and we weren't going to have any leaks. You're not going to see the inside of this boat at all once it's skinned, so we weren't really worried about it looking too ugly. With that done, we took it back over to the work table, and we just started sanding everything smooth and really cleaning up all those seams the best we could to prepare for trimming the entire thing out. Mike hit it with the sander, and I just went crazy with the Japanese pole saw, cutting off bits and bobs until, well, it started looking more and more like a nice, clean, sexy boat that it is. I have to say, if we had to pick a winner of a tool on this project, well, it'd probably be the jigsaw, but a close second would be the flush cut router trim bit. We use this thing to clean up practically every little bit and section of this boat, and it worked awesome. Although the bit did start to get caked in thickened epoxy and start to not work as well, but that's neither here or there. I'm willing to sacrifice one bit for the building of this boat. With the boat all skinned, except for the top, we decided to start adding some trim, so I milled down a bunch of mahogany. Since we're using Akume marine grade plywood, which is in the mahogany family, mahogany trim just seemed like a good choice. Now, because of the drastic curve of the boat, we couldn't do long runs because we couldn't get even 1/4-inch mahogany to bend that way. Now, we could have steam bent some pieces to get them to fit that curve, but 5-day boat build, guys. We just gotta do what we gotta do. So instead of using long runs, we used several littler sections, and we just spliced them together with some Total Boat epoxy. Of course, there on my first attempt to tack this in, I hit a screw and almost took off my finger. To hold the pieces on, I switched to a 23 gauge finish nailer just to hold them in place until the epoxy cured. This was a great option because we didn't even have to fill the holes when we were done because they were so tiny. And you have to remember, there is a crazy amount of thickened epoxy on the bottom of these trim pieces, so any holes I make in the trim are going to immediately be filled in with that thickened epoxy. Although it does seem a little weird to put a bunch of holes in the bottom of a boat. But hey, I think it's gonna float. We'll just have to wait and see. Trimming the bottom is as far as we got on the night of day 3. So on the morning of day 4, we came out determined to get our top on and the rest of the boat trimmed and start laying down varnish. So before we flipped over the boat to start working on the other trim, I got out the Rotex and I sanded everything down smooth so that we would be ready to roll for our next pieces of trim. So we flipped the boat over to expose the inside, and we were just about ready to put the top on when I had a realization. If we put the top on, then the entire inside of this boat would just be raw exposed plywood. And although there's not going to be a whole lot of water on the inside of this boat, we hope, I still didn't like leaving it raw. So before we put the top on, I loaded up a bottle of teak oil and we soaked the inside of this boat from bow to stern with just a ridiculous amount of teak oil. We weren't too concerned with how it looked. We were more concerned with just getting at least one small layer of protection on all that exposed plywood.
I want to take just a quick break from the boat build to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Policy Genius. Now, I'm going to get a little serious with you because this is a serious topic. Life insurance. Where do you get it? How do you get started? What do you do? Now, this is kind of an important topic to me. I lost my dad when I was 23 years old, and it was a really traumatic experience for me and the entire family. One of the few comforts that happened during that time was knowing that my father had life insurance.
But finding a good policy can be a daunting task. Luckily for you, there's Policy Genius. Policy Genius makes it easy to compare quotes from over a dozen top insurers all in one place. And the best part is that you could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. So, how do you get started? Don't worry, I'm going to tell you. Getting started is easy. First, head to policygenius.com/bourbonmoth. In minutes, you can work out how much life insurance coverage you need and compare personalized quotes to find your best price. When you're ready to apply, the Policy Genius team will handle the paperwork and scheduling for free. Policy Genius never sells your information to other companies, and Policy Genius doesn't add on extra fees. The licensed experts at Policy Genius work for you, not the insurance company, so you can trust them to help you navigate every step of the shopping and buying process. Head to policygenius.com/bourbonmoth to get started right now. Policy Genius. When it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right. With the inside coated in teak oil, we were ready to start cutting out the shape for our top panel. If you remember, back to the beginning of this video, we had already pre-traced this before we put on any of the other panels. We set it in place, and dang, this thing is starting to look like a flippin' speedboat. We were getting pretty darn excited. So again, with the epoxy on every single rib and surface. By the way, we made sure not to put teak oil on those exposed ribs so that the epoxy would still hold the top securely. Then we plopped the top down and, well, just started stapling it in place. Now, the top was the trickiest thing to staple because once we put the top on, obviously we couldn't see where any of our ribs were. But we pre-marked where they were on the outside. So once we had a few staples in the top, we used a chalk line to put a line right down the center of each rib so that we could find them again to add staples where we needed them to go. The other issue we had is trying to cover up these staples because we're not going to trim out the entire thing. We're just going to trim out the sides and then around the cockpit. So we tried to limit the amount of staples we put in the top as much as possible. Of course, we couldn't do that. So we had to have 2 lines of exposed staples on either side. But instead of just hammering them in willy-nilly, I had Mike mark out a perfect little mark every 2 inches along both sides. This way our staples would look more intentional and follow a uniform pattern. So while he marked those out, I just kept throwing in staples around the cockpit where things will be trimmed up. Then once I had the interior all stapled, I just started following along behind Mike, stapling on each one of his predetermined little marks. It actually kind of made a really cool stitched pattern on both sides. We filled all these staples eventually with wood filler, and it actually looks great. I don't think anyone would be like, "Hey man, what's with all those exposed staples?" After getting everything stapled, once again it was back to that good old trim flush cut router bit to clean everything up nice and smooth. By far the most satisfying thing to use the trim router on was our cockpit. We just loosely cut out a hole so we could get in there, and then zip, zip, zoop, we cut the whole thing out with that trim router. Gosh, I love that tool. Then with our top panel on, it was back to getting everything trimmed up. More mahogany, more thickened epoxy, and more 23 gauge brad nails. At times this was a frustrating process because the curve of the boat just fought us every step of the way, but we went slow and it was so satisfying in the end to watch this thing go from a bunch of plywood panels just kind of hooked together to what was starting to look like a nice, clean, trimmed out boat. There's the trim router again, just flush cutting everything nice and purty. The last thing that we had to trim out was, of course, around our cockpit. So I cut some more pieces of mahogany and we laid them in there nice and tight, tacking them down once again with that thickened epoxy and the 23 gauge brad nailer. And then we were almost ready to get some finish on this thing. But because we're on a time crunch, we had to figure out a way that we could finish all of the sides of the boat at the same time. Not have to do the top, wait for it to dry, flip it over, do the bottom, wait for it to dry, flip it over, do the top. You get the picture. So we thought suspending it from the ceiling would be the easiest. Now we didn't want to just drill a bunch of random holes in the boat, so we added this little ring at the nose. We thought it looked pretty boaty, so we'd get away with it. I mean, we did get it at a boat store after all. So with our ring nice and secure in the front with some thickened epoxy, it was time to do my all-time favorite thing. You guys know what it is. Sand our life away. We both got out some sanders and some sandpaper and we just started sanding. Mike filled a few staple holes, I sanded, I filled a few holes, he sanded. It was a process. Once we did the top, we flipped it over, and yep, you guessed it, more sanding on the bottom. Now, in a normal boat build, I would like to spend a good week very carefully and meticulously sanding every little part of this. But since we're doing this in 5 days, we had about an hour to get the whole thing sanded. But hey, it looks pretty darn sweet, doesn't it? Man, I can't wait to get this in the water. With the whole thing sanded, it was finally time to suspend it from the ceiling and get ready to lay down some varnish. The nice thing was this boat is still insanely light. We estimate about 60 pounds at this point, so we weren't too worried about hanging it from the ceiling. I just put some ratchet straps onto some hooks that were in studs, wheeled it over, hooked it on in the front with our nice little bow ring. I made this little wood piece to just sit underneath the cockpit, and just like that, it was hanging and ready for some total boat lust. That's right, we're just gonna smear lust all over the boat. We thinned down the varnish with a little total boat brushing thinner stuff. Then Michael started rolling and I followed right behind him with a brush, tipping everything out. Now I'm sure boat builders are gonna watch this varnish job and cringe. Yes, we probably should have cleaned my entire shop first to make sure there was no dust in the air and really done a crazy good job. We probably should have done 1 coat a day, let it cure and then sand, but we didn't have time. But the nice thing about the Total Boat Lust is that you can reapply within an hour. So even though it's probably not the most professional job, we were able to lay a lot of coats down in a relatively short amount of time. After doing 2 or 3 coats of varnish, we decided that this bad boy needed a name. So I called my friend Ryan, who lives down the street and owns a sign company, and he printed out this vinyl decal that Michael and I designed on the computer. We figured since it's a cocktail racer, it needs a cocktail type name. The Old Fashioned just seemed like the perfect fitting name to christen this old vessel. And the decal looks pretty darn sweet for designing it in 5 minutes just using clip art. But hey, you gotta do what you gotta do for a 5-day boat build. And in a few hours, more like half a day and part of a night, we had the entire thing varnished and we were ready to start working on that engine. So after letting the varnish completely cure, we very carefully slid the table underneath it, unhooked it, and wheeled it to the other side of the shop. Now I'm going to tell you right now that both Michael and I know absolutely nothing about motors and mechanics and boats or anything like that, so you might laugh a lot during this next part, but the important thing is we're just getting this done. The steering setup we ordered on Amazon basically is the steering column with a cable. When you turn the steering wheel, the cable pulls and loosens and it extends that rod back and forward. So the idea is that you transfer that motion from that rod moving back and forward somehow onto the motor to turn the motor backwards and forwards, or left to right to steer the boat. So we installed this steering column into the bracket that comes with it. We're not cool enough to like make up our own bracket. We just bolted the parts in place and we plopped the steering wheel on. That was the easy part. The harder part was trying to figure out how we were going to transfer this motion of the rod somehow to hook into the motor. Now this is a horrible angle, but as you can see, you turn the wheel and that rod goes in and out. I'll show you a better view later on. And then we unboxed the motor we ordered on Amazon. Now I mentioned in the first video, this isn't the motor we wanted. This is literally the only motor that we could get our hands on in such a short time period. It was the only motor on Amazon that would come in 2 days. It is a Funchick 3.6 horsepower outboard motor. Yeah, I never heard of a Funchick either. And we would have liked to have more than 3.6 horsepowers, but you gotta do what you gotta do in 5 days. So we just clamped that thing on there, and then I cut off this whole dealy bob. I think it's like a throttle and what you're supposed to use to steer, but it was in our way and bouncing around, and I figured, I don't think we need it. So chop chop, there it goes. Next, we had to figure out a way to mount that rod right below the motor. So I just made a quick little bracket with some hose clamps and a few pieces of mahogany, and we just tightened that thing on there. And as you can see, when you turn the steering wheel, that rod moves. You turn it one way, it moves one way. You turn it the other way, it moves the other way. So we needed a bracket to hold that rod to the motor. Enter my neighbor Justin, Rainfall Projects. If you're not following him on YouTube, go do it. His channel is awesome, and he is a whiz when it comes to just fabricating random things. So that's exactly what we had him do. Fabricate a random part to hook that rod to our motor. Don't worry, I'll show you exactly how it works later on, but for now, we got a few more things to do to the boat. For example, Michael thought we just had some extra time on our hands and that the dashboard needed a little bit of an upgrade. If you didn't know this about Michael Alm, he is the king of what is called patterned plywood. It's a way of cutting plywood into little tiny strips, gluing them back together, cutting them into more tiny strips, and gluing them back together again until you get a wonderful pattern. I'm not going to show you every step of how he does it because you can watch that over on his channel. He'll walk you through the entire process, nice and easy. But in just about an hour, he whipped up this cool patterned plywood dashboard, which really jazzed up the thing. With that installed, it was back to just fitting the boat with a bunch of random things we picked up at the marine store, like these sweet stainless steel tube handrails. Don't those look pretty nice on either side? Huh? It's looking like a boat. Then with that done, we started installing just a really simple floorboard. We needed a place to kneel or sit down on so we wouldn't be sitting on those ribs. That wouldn't be comfortable. Then with the floorboards installed, Michael hit that patterned plywood with just a little varnish to make that pattern just pop out and look sexy. Now, I mentioned I'd show you how this whole bracket thing works. You can see it there on the boat. The metal plate right here, that's what Justin fabbed up. it attaches to the motor itself. Then I just bent some flat stock pieces that we bolted onto that tube to transfer that motion. And we added a nice simple throttle. So now when you turn the steering wheel left to right, that tube goes out and in, and it transfers that power to the motor, making the motor go left and right. And would you guys flippin' believe that with that, the boat is done? And this little foreman was pretty darn excited. He really thought the boat was built just for him. I mean, to be fair, it is the size of a boat that you would think would be built for a 6-year-old. There was just one last thing that needed to be done. We had to slap on a bumper sticker. River tables. Just say no. If you're wondering what to actually do with epoxy, yeah, you're supposed to build flippin' boats with it, not porting ugly, colorful streams down the center of live edge wood. Stop doing that. Sometimes you choose a project, but sometimes it almost seems like the project chooses you. Sometimes when you finish a build, it almost seems like it was meant to be built all along. Like it was your destiny to be at this point in time, doing this thing, having this experience. Yeah, this wasn't one of those projects. This thing we just slapped together in the course of 5 days, so let's get it in the water and see if it actually floats. This is it. Don't get scared now. Hey, what do you know? Not bad for 5 days. And yes, I did just wipe my wet hands on my butt. But the real question is, are 3.6 horses enough to make this thing glide over the water with the greatest of ease? We turned it on, started it up, and I hopped in, ready to set out, not knowing if I was gonna go anywhere or if I was gonna do a loop-de-loop. It could be anybody's guess. Mike was nice enough to push me off, and I waited to start the propeller until his ankles were well clear. And I hit that throttle. And what happened was, well, this. Yeah, it moves forward. It goes nicely through the water. It floats very well. But we figured the top speed was right around maybe 10 miles an hour, if that. It was clear that 3.6 horsepower just wasn't enough to really make this puppy dance. But the important thing was, it's a boat. A boat that we built in only 5 freaking days. It was a crazy time. It was a fun time. And man, it was an exhausting time. I slept for like a week after we finished this thing. When I was done, it was time for Michael to go. I thought that maybe because he was quite a bit lighter than me, he would have a little more success getting it on plane and really opening this puppy up. But no, it was about the same. It just putted around. I mean, it's a lot of fun, but don't be surprised if you see another video with me and Michael in the future where we upgrade this bad boy with a legitimate engine. 3.6 horsepower? Nah, let's go for 10. I bet that'll turn this thing up a notch. After me and Mike both had a turn, it was time for somebody else to get a ride. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of room in this thing. It's definitely more of a one-person type ordeal. But the foreman's only 6, and he insisted on climbing aboard. So we set off into the sunset. Just me, the foreman, on the open sea. Actually, it's a lake, but you get the picture. After driving around for a little bit with him sitting on my lap, I decided to, get a little wild and crazy. Maybe stand up, do some tricks, really try and impress the crowd. When I built my first boat, it took me 3.5 months and was a project that I had dreamed about since I was a little boy. When I built this one, it was a project that I thought about for 5 minutes before we got started. The fact that I've now built 2 boats within the span of a year is just kind of nuts. And I would like to say I won't be building another one anytime soon, but I gotta admit, I'm actually really starting to like the whole boat building thing, so who knows what'll happen. My point is this: whether you've been planning a build for 5 years or 5 minutes, get in there, have fun, give it your all, and whatever you do, don't forget it takes some time to enjoy it when you're all finished.
Hey, well, we did it. 5-day boat build. And I don't know about you, I think it looks pretty darn good for 5 days. If you haven't already, go over to Michael Alm's YouTube channel, Alm Fab. I will link it somewhere around this vicinity. And you can watch both of his videos, part 1 and 2, on this exact same build. He's got a little bit of a different filming style than me, so they're practically completely different videos. So go check that out, subscribe down below, go follow me on Instagram and Facebook, check out my Patreon link in the video description, and I think that's about it. Oh, gosh.